Behind the polished smiles and perfectly orchestrated public appearances lies a world most people never see. What happens when the future king and queen of England step away from the cameras, shed their formal roles, and become just William and Catherine? What secrets emerge when royal protocol meets real human emotion in the ancient desert kingdom of Jordan? This is the untold story of a journey that would test their marriage, challenge their duties, and reveal truths that could shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. In the land where Lawrence of Arabia once walked, where ancient Petra holds mysteries carved in stone, and where modern diplomacy dances with age-old traditions, two of the world's most watched people would discover that sometimes the most important moments happen when nobody is supposed to be watching. What started as a routine diplomatic visit would become something far more dangerous, far more personal, and far more revealing than anyone could have imagined. Because in Jordan, where the desert wind carries both sand and secrets, William and Catherine would face choices that would define not just their future as royals, but their truth as human beings. The after-party invitation that arrived that evening would change everything. But first, they had to survive the day that almost ended their marriage before it could be saved. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Queen Ali International Airport as the Royal Air Force aircraft touched down in Amman. Catherine adjusted her modest blue dress, ensuring her shoulders were properly covered, while William checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The tension between them had been building for weeks, and now, trapped together on this official visit to Jordan, there was nowhere to hide from the problems they had been avoiding. Remember, we have the children's hospital visit first, then the refugee camp, followed by lunch with King Abdullah, William said, his voice carrying the strain of someone who had repeated these details countless times. The embassy reception is at 7, and then we're free for the evening. Catherine nodded without looking at him, her attention focused on the small mirror in her compact as she applied a fresh coat of lipstick. Free being a relative term, of course, she said quietly. When are we ever really free, William? The question hung between them like a challenge. It was the same question that had been haunting their private conversations for months. Ever since George had started school and Charlotte had begun asking why Mummy and Daddy always seemed tired, ever since the weight of their future roles had begun to feel less like an honor and more like a prison sentence they were serving together, but separately. Their protection officer, Inspector Davies, appeared at the aircraft door. Your Royal Highnesses, King Abdullah's representatives, are waiting on the tarmac. The motorcade is ready when you are. William stood first, straightening his dark suit jacket. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something to Catherine, something real and unscripted, but the moment passed. Instead, he offered her his arm with the same formal courtesy he would show to any dignitary's wife. She took it with practiced grace, and together they stepped into the blazing Jordanian sunshine. The official welcome was everything it should have been. Traditional dancers in colorful costumes, children waving small British and Jordanian flags, and dignitaries lined up for formal introductions. Catherine smiled her perfect public smile, the one she had perfected over years of royal duties, while William engaged in the kind of diplomatic small talk that came as naturally to him as breathing. To the watching crowds and media, they appeared to be the perfect royal couple, united in purpose and deeply in love. But Layla al-Rashid noticed something different. As Jordan's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and the woman responsible for coordinating the royal visit, she had studied hundreds of hours of footage of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. She had memorized their usual patterns of interaction. The way William would place his hand on Catherine's back when guiding her through crowds, how Catherine would catch his eye and smile when he said something amusing during speeches. Today, those small intimacies were absent. They seemed more formal than usual, her assistant, Rashid, observed as they watched the couple being introduced to the hospital staff during their first official engagement. Layla nodded thoughtfully. She had spent 3 years studying in London and had learned to read the subtle signs of English reserve. Sometimes the most public people are the most private about their struggles, she said quietly. Come, we need to ensure the lunch arrangements are perfect. King Abdullah wants this visit to strengthen our relationship with Britain, and that means keeping our guests comfortable. At the children's hospital, Catherine found herself genuinely engaged for the first time that day. She sat beside a 7-year-old girl named Amira who was recovering from heart surgery, listening as the child spoke in careful English about her dreams of becoming a doctor. My teacher says girls can be anything now, Amira said seriously. Even queens. Catherine laughed, the first genuine laugh William had heard from her in weeks. Girls can absolutely be anything, she agreed, brushing Amira's hair away from her face. Though being a queen is quite complicated. Sometimes you have to be very good at pretending everything is perfect, even when it isn't. William, who was supposed to be focused on his conversation with the hospital director, found himself listening instead to his wife. There was something in her voice, a vulnerability he hadn't heard in months of careful, polite conversations about schedules and responsibilities and everything except what was actually wrong between them. Do you pretend sometimes? Amira asked with the directness that only children possess. Catherine glanced toward William, not knowing he was listening. Sometimes pretending is part of taking care of people you love, she said softly. But it could get very tiring. The moment was interrupted by the flash of cameras and the gentle guidance of their handlers moving them toward the next scheduled interaction. But something had shifted in the atmosphere between William and Catherine, a crack in a wall they had built around their problems. Their visit to the Za'atari refugee camp was scheduled to last 2 hours. They walked through the temporary streets of this city of tents and prefabricated buildings, meeting families who had fled the violence in Syria and were now rebuilding their lives in this desert sanctuary. Catherine spoke with women who had left everything behind to protect their children, while William discussed education and job training programs with men who had once been doctors and teachers and engineers, and now found themselves starting over with nothing but hope. A 12-year-old boy named Omar approached William during a break between official meetings. The boy spoke excellent English, learned from YouTube videos on a smartphone his family had somehow managed to keep charged despite their circumstances. Your Highness, Omar said with impressive formality, may I ask you something personal? William's protection team tensed, but something in the boy's earnest expression made William nod. Of course, Omar. Do you ever feel lost? Even when everyone is watching you and expecting you to know exactly what to do. The question hit William like a physical blow. Here was a child who had lost his home, his country, his entire way of life, asking if a future king ever felt lost. William looked around the camp at the thousands of people who had lost everything but were still fighting to build something new and felt ashamed of his own problems. But he also felt, for the first time in months, completely understood. Yes, William said simply. Sometimes I feel very lost, especially lately. Omar nodded seriously. My father says feeling lost means you're thinking about where you want to go. If you never felt lost, you would never look for a better path. Your father is a wise man. He was a philosophy professor in Damascus. Now he teaches children in Tent 47B. He says wisdom doesn't need a university, just an open mind. William found Catherine an hour later, sitting in the shade with a group of women who were teaching each other English and Arabic. She was laughing at her own terrible pronunciation of Arabic phrases, and the women were gently correcting her with the kind of patient kindness that comes from understanding struggle. How do you say I'm sorry in Arabic? Catherine asked one of the women. Ana Asif, the woman replied. But why do you need to know this? Catherine glanced up and saw William approaching. Sometimes saying sorry in a different language makes it easier to remember what you really mean. The woman followed Catherine's gaze and saw William standing there, clearly wanting to join the conversation, but uncertain of his welcome. Ah, she said with the knowing smile of someone who had been married for 20 years. In Arabic, we say that the heart speaks all languages, but sometimes the mouth forgets how to let it. Catherine stood and walked toward William, meeting him halfway between her group and his. For a moment, they stood there in the desert heat, surrounded by people who had lost everything, but somehow seemed more connected to what mattered than either of them had felt in months. "That boy Omar told me something interesting," William said. "What was that?" "That feeling lost might mean you're ready to find a better path." Catherine looked around the camp, at the children playing football between the tents despite everything they had endured, at the adults who were building schools and shops and small businesses from nothing because they refused to give up hope. "Maybe we've been so afraid of being lost that we forgot we were already lost," she said quietly. "Catherine, your Royal Highnesses?" Layla appeared beside them, tablet in hand, and the slightly stressed expression of someone managing a complex schedule. "I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but we need to begin moving toward the motorcade. King Abdullah is expecting you for lunch in 30 minutes, and the traffic between here and the palace can be unpredictable." The spell was broken, but something had started. As they walked toward their waiting cars, Catherine surprised William by slipping her hand into his. Not for the cameras, not for the diplomatic protocol, but for themselves. "We'll finish this conversation," she said quietly. "Yes," William agreed, squeezing her hand. "We will." The lunch with King Abdullah took place in a private dining room overlooking the hills of Oman. The king was an easy conversationalist, sharing stories of his own royal childhood and the unique challenges of leading a country while maintaining relationships with family. His wife, Queen Rania, proved to be equally engaging, discussing her work in education and her efforts to improve opportunities for women throughout the Middle East. "Marriage is difficult enough without the added pressure of public scrutiny," Queen Rania said during dessert, speaking directly to Catherine. "I remember the first year after our wedding, when every magazine wanted to analyze what my clothing choices meant about my politics, my mood, my respect for tradition. It can make you feel like you're living your life for everyone except yourself." Catherine nodded gratefully. It was rare to meet someone who truly understood the peculiar isolation of being a royal wife. "Sometimes I wonder if we're teaching our children to be authentically themselves or just to be more sophisticated actors than their parents." "Both, probably," King Abdullah interjected with a gentle smile. "But if you're worried about it, that's probably a good sign. The ones who should worry are those who never question whether they're doing it right." After lunch, William and Catherine had an hour of unscheduled time before their next engagement. Instead of returning to their hotel, they asked if they could walk through the old city of Amman. Layla quickly arranged for discreet security coverage and led them through the narrow streets of downtown, past shops selling everything from traditional Jordanian jewelry to modern electronics. They stopped at a small cafe where an elderly man named Hussein served them traditional Arabic coffee while his grandson translated between Arabic and English. Hussein had lived through the city's transformation from a small desert town to a modern capital, and he spoke about change with the patience of someone who had learned to adapt without losing his essential self. "Change is like water," Hussein said through his grandson. "It can flow around rocks, or it can break them, depending on how hard the rock tries to resist." Catherine and William spent 20 minutes sitting in that cafe, drinking bitter coffee and watching the late afternoon crowd flow past the windows. They didn't talk about their marriage or their problems or their royal duties. Instead, they talked about the coffee, the architecture, the sound of Arabic conversation flowing around them like music in an unfamiliar key. "I'd forgotten," Catherine said as they prepared to leave. "Forgotten what?" "How quiet my mind gets when I'm not performing. When I'm just sitting somewhere being nobody in particular." William understood exactly what she meant. "We should find more places where we can be nobody in particular." "Your Royal Highnesses." Their protection officer appeared with a subtle urgency that meant their brief respite was over. "The embassy reception begins in 2 hours. We should return to the hotel so you can prepare." As they walked back toward their waiting car, Catherine noticed a small gallery displaying photographs of Jordan throughout the decades. In the window was a black and white image from the 1950s showing King Hussein and Queen Noor dancing at what appeared to be a casual gathering, both laughing at something outside the frame. "They look happy," Catherine observed. "They look human," William corrected gently. That evening's embassy reception was held in the gardens of the British ambassador's residence. The guest list included Jordanian government officials, British business leaders working in the region, and representatives from various cultural organizations. William and Catherine moved through the crowd with their usual professional grace, making appropriate conversation and ensuring that everyone felt acknowledged and valued. But Layla noticed that something had changed since the afternoon. The formal distance between them had diminished. They weren't putting on a performance of marital harmony. They simply seemed more present with each other and more genuinely engaged with their hosts. "Your Royal Highnesses seem to be enjoying Jordan," observed Dr. Mahmoud Khoury, a historian from the University of Jordan who specialized in British-Jordanian relations. "Very much," Catherine replied. "There's something about being here that makes everything feel more authentic somehow. Perhaps because Jordan has always been a place where different worlds meet," Dr. Khoury suggested. "East and West, ancient and modern, tradition and innovation. It teaches you that you can honor where you come from while still growing into something new." William, who had been listening while seemingly focused on his conversation with the ambassador, found himself thinking about that observation for the rest of the evening. The reception was winding down when Layla approached them with a slightly conspiratorial expression. "Your Royal Highnesses, I have an unusual invitation to extend. My cousin Amara is hosting a small gathering tonight at her home in Abdown. It's nothing official, just friends and family celebrating her engagement. She asked me to invite you, if you're interested in seeing how ordinary Jordanians celebrate such occasions." William and Catherine exchanged a look. Their evening was officially over. Their next scheduled event wasn't until the following morning. But attending a private party would mean stepping completely outside the controlled environment of official royal visits. "What kind of gathering?" Catherine asked. "Traditional music, good food, and conversation," Layla replied. "Amara's fiancé is a musician, and his friends often play together. Nothing formal, nothing that requires speeches or official protocol. Just celebration." "Would our presence be disruptive?" William asked thoughtfully. "Amara's friends are artists, teachers, doctors. They're interested in people, not titles. But I should mention that some of them may not speak English fluently, and the music will be quite different from what you're probably used to." Catherine looked at William. For the first time all day, his expression was completely unguarded, showing genuine interest rather than polite duty. "I think," she said slowly, "that sounds exactly like what we need." An hour later, after changing into more casual clothes and briefing their protection team on the new plan, William and Catherine found themselves standing outside a modest two-story house in one of Amman's residential neighborhoods. The sound of music and laughter drifted from the garden behind the house, and warm light spilled from every window. Amara greeted them at the door with the easy warmth of someone who treated royal visitors the same way she would welcome any friend. She was a striking woman in her late 20s, wearing a beautiful traditional dress embroidered with silver thread and modern jewelry that somehow made the overall effect contemporary rather than costume-like. "Welcome to my home," she said in excellent English. "Come, you must meet my fiancé Tariq and try my mother's maklaba. She's been cooking since yesterday because she wanted everything to be perfect, but then decided that trying to be perfect would ruin the point of the evening." They were led through a house filled with the kind of comfortable chaos that comes from a family that actually lives together rather than simply occupying the same space. Children ran between rooms playing games that seemed to involve a great deal of laughing and mock arguing, while adults moved between the kitchen and the garden carrying platters of food and instruments and conversations that picked up and dropped off and picked up again as people moved through the space. In the garden, they found about 30 people of various ages gathered around low tables laden with food. Someone was playing the oud, the pear-shaped lute that forms the heart of much Arabic music, while others talked and ate and laughed with the easy intimacy of old friends. "Tariq, come meet our guests," Amara called. Tariq proved to be a tall, gentle man with musician's hands and the kind of smile that made everyone around him feel welcome. "Your Highnesses, we're honored you could join us. Though I should warn you, my friends will probably try to teach you to play instruments you've never heard of, and my mother will definitely try to feed you until you can't move." "That sounds wonderful," Catherine said, and meant it. What followed was unlike anything either William or Catherine had experienced in their royal lives. They sat on cushions around low tables, eating with their hands and attempting to follow conversations that mixed Arabic and English and sometimes involved three different discussions happening simultaneously. Tariq's mother did indeed insist on bringing them plate after plate of food, explaining each dish in Arabic while her daughter-in-law translated with affectionate exasperation. When the music started in earnest, Catherine found herself sitting beside an elderly woman named Fatima, who spoke very little English but communicated volumes through gestures and facial expressions. Fatima seemed determined to teach Catherine the intricate rhythms of traditional Jordanian hand-clapping that accompany the songs, laughing each time Catherine got the pattern wrong and patiently demonstrating again. William, meanwhile, was in conversation with Tariq and two other musicians about the structure of Arabic musical scales. Despite having no formal training in non-Western music, he found himself fascinated by the way these men discussed rhythm and melody as if they were talking about breathing or walking, something so fundamental that it didn't require technical vocabulary to understand. "Music is like marriage," one of the musicians, a drummer named Samir, said in careful English. "Sometimes you follow the rhythm everyone expects, and sometimes you have to create something completely new together. But if you're not listening to each other, it just becomes noise." William glanced across the circle to where Catherine was laughing as Fatima continued her patient rhythm lessons. In the warm light of the paper lanterns strung through the garden trees, his wife looked more relaxed than he had seen her in months. "How do you know when you're creating something new versus just making noise?" William asked. Samir smiled and gestured toward Tariq and Amara, who were now dancing together to the music their friends were playing. "When it makes other people want to dance," he said simply. As the evening progressed, the formal barriers that normally surrounded William and Catherine began to dissolve entirely. Children who had no idea they were playing with future monarchs recruited them for a game that seemed to involve racing around the garden while carrying serving trays without spilling the contents. Catherine found herself shrieking with laughter as she tried to navigate an obstacle course made of garden chairs while balancing a tray of empty teacups, while William discovered that his military training was surprisingly useful for games that involved tactical thinking and quick reflexes. "You're very good at this," observed Amara's 10-year-old nephew, who had appointed himself William's teammate. "Are you sure you're really a prince? You seem too normal." "Thank you," William replied seriously. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me in months." Later, as the children were called into bed and the gathering settled into the more intimate phase of the evening, Tariq asked if William and Catherine would like to hear the traditional song that would be sung at his and Amara's wedding. "It's very old," Amara explained. "About two people who find each other in the desert and decide to make the journey together rather than continuing alone. The words are quite simple, but the meaning changes depending on where you are in your own journey." The song was performed by three musicians playing the oud, a traditional drum called a derbuka, and a wooden flute called a ney. The melody was haunting and complex with rhythms that seemed to shift and change like sand dunes in the wind. Even without understanding the Arabic words, William and Catherine found themselves moved by something essential in the music, something that spoke to the universal experience of finding and keeping and rediscovering love. When the song ended, the garden was quiet except for the distant sounds of the city and the soft conversation of people who were in no hurry to end the evening. "What do the words mean?" Catherine asked softly. Tariq translated slowly, choosing his English words carefully. "They say, I was walking alone through the desert, following a star I could not name. You were walking alone through the desert, following the same star. When our paths crossed, we realized we had been looking for each other all along, but we had forgotten each other's names. Now we will walk together, and when the desert tries to separate us, we will remember that we are both following the same star." Catherine felt William reach for her hand in the darkness. She wove their fingers together and squeezed gently, a gesture that felt like recognition and promise and apology all at once. "That's beautiful," she said. "Yes," William agreed quietly. "It is." It was nearly midnight when they finally said their goodbyes. Amara and Tariq insisted on packing them food to take back to their hotel, while Fatima gave Catherine a long, fierce hug and spoke rapid Arabic that Amara translated as, "She says you have kind eyes, but they look tired. She's praying for you to find rest. Please tell her thank you," Catherine said, "and that tonight I feel more rested than I have in a very long time." As their car pulled away from the house glowed with warm light behind their hosts, and the sound of laughter and conversation continued as if the evening was just beginning rather than ending. "That was—" William started, then stopped. "I know," Catherine said quietly. "It was exactly what I didn't know we needed." They rode back to their hotel in comfortable silence, both processing an evening that had been nothing like their usual royal engagements. There had been no speeches, no formal presentations, no diplomatic objectives achieved. Instead, they had spent 4 hours being treated like people rather than positions, like friends rather than figureheads. Back in their hotel suite, Catherine kicked off her shoes and collapsed into one of the sitting room chairs with a kind of satisfied exhaustion that comes from genuine enjoyment rather than professional duty. "We should talk," she said without preamble. "Yes," William agreed, settling into the chair across from her. "We should." For the first time in months, neither of them seemed afraid of what that conversation might reveal. The conversation that followed would later be remembered by both William and Catherine as the moment their marriage began to find its way back to itself. Sitting in the soft lamplight of their hotel suite, with the sounds of Amman filtering through the windows and the taste of Tariq's mother's cooking still on their tongues, they finally found the courage to say things they had been thinking for months, but had been too afraid, too tired, or too caught up in their royal obligations to voice. "I feel like I'm disappearing," Catherine said without looking at William. She was staring at her hands, turning her wedding ring around and around on her finger. "Not as the Duchess of Cambridge. That person is fine. She shows up to events, she smiles at the right moments, she says appropriate things to dignitaries and charities and photographers. But Catherine, just Catherine, the person who married you because she couldn't imagine being happy with anyone else. I don't know where she went." William was quiet for a long moment, processing words that articulated something he had been sensing but hadn't known how to name. "I think," he said carefully, "that I've been so focused on being the person everyone expects the future king to be that I forgot how to be the person who fell in love with you. And worse than that, I think I forgot to notice that you were struggling with the same thing." "When did it happen?" Catherine asked. "When did we stop being us and start being them?" "Maybe it's been gradual," William said. "Like those old stories about frogs in slowly heating water. You don't notice you're boiling until it's almost too late." Catherine looked up at him then, really looked at him for what felt like the first time in months. In the lamplight, away from the formal clothes and public settings, he looked younger than his years and tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Are we too late?" "No," William said immediately, with a certainty that surprised them both. "Tonight, watching you laugh with that woman while she taught you to clap rhythms, seeing you play games with children who treated you like their favorite aunt rather than a duchess, that was you, the real you. And I remembered what it felt like to be in love with that person instead of just married to her." "You were different tonight, too," Catherine admitted. "When you were talking with the musicians about scales and rhythm, when you were asking questions because you were actually curious rather than because curiosity was diplomatically appropriate. I haven't seen you be genuinely interested in anything in months." They talked until 3 in the morning. Not about their schedule for the following day or their responsibilities to their children or the monarchy or the British people, but about themselves. They talked about the things they missed about their life before marriage, about the dreams they had quietly abandoned because they didn't seem compatible with royal duty, about the small daily compromises that had accumulated over the years until they felt more like roommates managing a very public household than partners building a life together. "I miss making decisions," Catherine said at one point. Real decisions, not just choosing between two outfits that have both been selected by other people, or picking which charity event to prioritize when they're all equally worthy, and my choice doesn't actually matter because the schedule has already been set by someone else. I miss being surprised, William added. Everything is planned, every conversation is briefed, every outcome is anticipated. Sometimes I think the most spontaneous thing in my life is whether I take one sugar or two in my tea, and even that's probably noted somewhere in a file marked Duke of Cambridge. Personal preferences. Do you think your mother felt this way? Catherine asked quietly. It was the first time either of them had mentioned Diana in the context of their own marriage struggles, though both had been thinking about her increasingly often as they tried to navigate the same impossible balance between public duty and private happiness that had ultimately defeated her. William considered the question seriously. I think she felt it more intensely than we do, he said finally. She was younger when she married into the family, and she had less preparation for what it would actually be like. But, yes, I think she struggled with the same feeling of being slowly erased by expectations. The difference is that she didn't have someone going through it with her. My father was already fully formed as a royal when they married. He couldn't understand why she found it so difficult to simply become the person the role required her to be. Sometimes I wonder if we're being selfish, Catherine admitted, complaining about a life of enormous privilege, worrying about our personal happiness when we have resources and opportunities that most people could never dream of. Maybe we would be selfish if we were just complaining, William replied thoughtfully. But we're not just complaining. We're trying to figure out how to be authentic people within an institution that often seems designed to eliminate authenticity. And I think that matters not just for us, but for the monarchy itself. If we can't find a way to be genuine within these roles, how can we expect to genuinely serve the people we're supposed to represent? Catherine curled up in her chair, pulling her legs underneath her in a gesture that would have been unthinkable during any public appearance, but felt natural in the privacy of their temporary home. Tonight, listening to that wedding song, I kept thinking about the line about walking toward the same star, but forgetting each other's names. I feel like we've been so focused on walking in the right direction, following the path laid out for us, that we forgot we chose to walk it together. So what do we do? William asked. How do we remember each other's names without abandoning the path entirely? I don't know, Catherine said honestly, but I know that tonight felt like a beginning rather than an ending. For the first time in months, I felt like myself, and like your wife at the same time. When they finally went to bed, they fell asleep holding hand for the first time since before George started school. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a promise. The next morning brought the third day of their official visit to Jordan. Their schedule included a tour of the ancient city of Petra, followed by a formal dinner hosted by King Abdullah and Queen Rania. But something fundamental had shifted between them overnight, and both their hosts and their staff noticed the change immediately. They seemed lighter today, Layla observed to her assistant as they watched William and Catherine emerge from their hotel, more connected to each other. The Deputy Minister of Protocol mentioned that they attended Amara's engagement party last night, Rashid replied. Perhaps spending time with regular people reminded them that they're regular people too, underneath all the titles. The drive to Petra took 2 hours through Jordan's desert landscape. Instead of reviewing briefing materials or catching up on correspondence, William and Catherine spent the journey looking out the windows and talking about the scenery, the history Layla shared about the regions they were passing through, and their own reactions to being in a place so different from anything they were used to. It's strange, Catherine observed as they wound through the mountains approaching Petra, how being somewhere completely foreign can make you feel more like yourself than being in familiar places. Maybe because foreign places don't have expectations about who you should be, William suggested. They just let you figure out fresh. Petra itself was overwhelming in the way that genuine wonders of the world always are. No amount of photography or description can prepare someone for the reality of walking through the narrow canyon called the Sick and emerging to face the treasury, the massive facade carved directly into the rose-colored stone by people who died more than 2,000 years ago. But What struck both William and Catherine most powerfully was not the ancient architecture, impressive as it was, but the sense of perspective it provided. Standing in front of monuments built by a civilization that had once been the center of the known world and then disappeared in a legend, their own problems seemed both more manageable and more important at the same time. Makes you think about legacy, William said as they stood in the shade of the treasury, watching tourists from a dozen different countries take photographs and speak to each other in languages they couldn't identify. What kind of legacy do you want to leave? Catherine asked. I used to think it was about maintaining the monarchy, preserving tradition, being a steady, reliable link between the past and the future, William replied. But lately, I think I want to leave a legacy of having figured out how to be authentically human within an inhuman system. I want George and Charlotte and Louis to know that it's possible to honor your responsibilities while still honoring yourself. That's a harder legacy than just being a good king, Catherine pointed out. Yes, William agreed. But I think it's a more important one. Their Petra guide was a local historian named Dr. Sarah Nabolsi, a woman in her 50s who had spent 30 years studying Nabatean civilization. As she led them through the ancient city, she talked about the Nabateans' remarkable ability to adapt and innovate while maintaining their cultural identity. They were traders and diplomats, Nabolsi explained as they walked through what had once been the city's main marketplace. They had to work with Romans, Greeks, Arabs, Persians, and dozens of other cultures. But they never became Romans or Greeks. They became themselves more completely by learning how to engage authentically with others. How did they manage that balance? Catherine asked, genuinely curious. By being very clear about what was essential to their identity and what was negotiable, Dr. Nabolsi replied. They would adopt new technologies, new artistic techniques, even new religious practices when those things serve their purposes. But they never compromised on their core values: hospitality, independence, and respect for the desert that shaped them. William and Catherine exchanged a look. The parallels to their own situation were obvious, but Dr. Nabolsi seemed unaware that she was providing marriage counseling disguised as historical education. The Nabateans also understood something that many civilizations forget. Dr. Nabolsi continued as they climbed the ancient steps toward the monastery. Individual happiness and collective responsibility aren't opposites. The health of the community depends on the health of its individual members. A trader who was miserable or inauthentic couldn't represent Nabatean interests effectively. Personal fulfillment was a professional requirement. They spent 4 hours exploring Petra, climbing ancient staircases and examining tombs and temples and meeting spaces carved into the living rock. By the time they emerged from the site, both William and Catherine were physically exhausted, but mentally energized in a way they hadn't experienced in months. I feel like I've been inside a three-dimensional history lesson, Catherine said as they settled into their car for the drive back to Amman. More than that, William added, I feel like we've been getting advice from people who figured out problems similar to ours, but from a completely different angle. Layla, who had been watching their reactions throughout the day, decided to take a calculated risk. Your Royal Highnesses, I have another unofficial invitation for this evening, if you're interested. What kind of invitation? William asked. There's a small cultural center in downtown Amman where local artists and intellectuals gather on Thursday evenings to discuss philosophy, politics, art, literature. It's very informal, very intellectual, and the conversations can be quite challenging. This week, they're discussing the relationship between individual identity and social responsibility. Given your reactions to Petra today, I thought you might find it interesting. Catherine and William looked at each other. Their official dinner with King Abdullah was scheduled for tomorrow evening, which meant tonight was supposedly a rest evening, time to recover from the day's touring and prepare for their final formal engagements. Would we be intruding? Catherine asked. The organizer is a professor of philosophy at the University of Jordan named Dr. Khalil Mansour. When I mentioned that you were visiting Jordan, he said that anyone genuinely interested in ideas is always welcome, regardless of their background. But I should warn you that these people will treat you as intellectual equals, which means they'll expect you to defend your positions rather than just listening politely. That sounds terrifying, William said with a grin. And exactly what we need. 3 hours later, after a quiet dinner at their hotel and time to read through some of the philosophical texts that Dr. Mansour had suggested, William and Catherine found themselves in a small bookshop that served as an informal cultural center 3 evenings a week. The space was cramped and comfortable, with mismatched chairs arranged in a rough circle and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves in both Arabic and English. Dr. Mansour proved to be a thin, intense man in his early 60s with the kind of restless intellectual energy that made everyone around him think faster and more clearly. He introduced William and Catherine to the group as friends visiting from England who were interested in the questions we're exploring tonight, without mentioning their titles or royal status. Tonight, we're discussing a question that has been troubling philosophers for thousands of years. Dr. Mansour began. How does a person maintain authentic individual identity while also fulfilling their responsibilities to family, community, and society? Is it possible to be truly yourself while also being truly committed to something larger than yourself? The conversation that followed was unlike anything William or Catherine had ever experienced. The 12 participants included professors, artists, journalists, and social workers, ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s. They debated with passionate intensity, building on each other's ideas and challenging each other's assumptions with the kind of intellectual honesty that comes from genuine respect and genuine disagreement. A young woman named Rana, who worked with refugee resettlement programs, argued that individual authenticity was a luxury that only people with security could afford. When you're responsible for other people's survival, she said, you don't have the privilege of worrying about whether you're being true to yourself. You have to be whatever those people need you to be. This sparked a heated response from Omar, a painter in his 30s. But if you lose yourself completely in service to others, what are you actually serving them with? An empty shell? A series of performances? How can you give people something real if you don't know what's real about yourself? Dr. Mansour turned to William and Catherine, who had been listening intently, but hadn't yet contributed to the discussion. You've been quiet, he observed. What do you think? Is it possible to be authentically yourself while also meeting the expectations others have for you? Catherine felt her heart race. In her entire adult life, she had never been in a situation where she was expected to offer her own philosophical opinions to a group of strangers who would judge those opinions purely on their merit rather than on diplomatic politeness. I think, she said slowly, that the question assumes individual authenticity and social responsibility are in opposition to each other. But maybe that's wrong. Maybe the problem isn't that we have to choose between being ourselves and serving others, but that we don't understand what service actually means. Explain, said Layla, a retired judge who had been following the conversation with sharp attention. Well, Catherine continued, feeling her way through ideas she had never articulated before. If service means performing a role that other people have defined, then, yes, that's probably in opposition to authenticity. But if service means bringing the best of who you really are to the task of helping other people become the best of who they really are, that's different. But how do you know what the best of who you really are actually is? Asked Samir, a journalist who covered social justice issues. Most of us learn who we are through trial and error, through trying different things and seeing what feels right. If your role is defined for you from birth, how do you ever get to experiment? William surprised himself by laughing. You experiment in secret, he said, where you find ways to experiment within the constraints you've been given. But you're right that it's harder and takes longer, and sometimes you feel like you're 20 years behind everyone else in figuring out basic things about yourself. Is that experience speaking? Dr. Mansour asked with genuine curiosity rather than intrusive prying. Yes, William admitted. Very much experience speaking. The conversation continued for 2 hours, ranging across topics of duty and freedom, tradition and innovation, the relationship between personal happiness and social good. What impressed both William and Catherine was the way the group treated ideas as living things to be examined from multiple angles rather than positions to be defended or attacked. In Sufi tradition, said Fatima, an elderly woman who taught comparative religion at the university, there's a concept called fana, which refers to the dissolution of the ego in service to the divine. But the goal isn't to disappear entirely. The goal is to become so authentically yourself that there's no contradiction between what you want and what God wants from you. Perfect individuality becomes perfect service. That sounds beautiful in theory, Rana replied. But how do you achieve it practically? Especially when what the world seems to want from you conflicts with what you want for yourself. Maybe, Catherine said thoughtfully, the conflict exists because we're asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, how do I balance what I want with what others need? We should ask, how do I want the same things that will serve others best? You're suggesting that authentic self-development and effective service can become the same thing, Dr. Mansour observed. I'm wondering if they have to be, Catherine replied. If the point of developing yourself is to have more to offer others, and the point of serving others is to become more yourself through that service. Omar leaned forward in his chair. But that requires enormous trust. Trust that becoming more yourself will make you more useful rather than more selfish. Trust that serving others authentically will help you grow rather than diminish you. Yes, William said quietly. It requires a level of trust that's quite frightening when you're responsible for things larger than yourself. As the evening wound down and participants began to say their goodbyes, Dr. Mansour pulled William and Catherine aside. You've both been thinking about these questions seriously, he observed. Not just intellectually, but personally. That's rare and valuable. Thank you for including us, Catherine said. This has been one of the most stimulating conversations I've had in years. Ideas need to be tested in real circumstances by real people facing real challenges, Dr. Mansour replied. Otherwise, philosophy becomes just an intellectual game. Whatever challenges you're facing in your own lives, remember that working through them thoughtfully and authentically is a service to everyone who faces similar struggles. Walking back to their hotel through the quiet streets of Amman, William and Catherine processed the evening in comfortable silence. They had spent 3 hours being treated as serious adults grappling with serious questions, rather than as figureheads offering polite platitudes about topics they weren't expected to understand deeply. I feel like my brain has been stretched, Catherine said finally. In a good way? In an excellent way. I've forgotten what it felt like to think about big questions with other people who were actually interested in the answers rather than in appearing to care about the questions. That woman Fatima, William said. Her point about becoming so authentically yourself that there's no contradiction between what you want and what your role requires. That feels like something we should aim for. It also feels like something that might take years to achieve, Catherine pointed out. Maybe, but at least now we have a direction to work toward rather than just problems to solve. Back in their hotel suite, they found themselves energized rather than exhausted despite the long day. Instead of falling into their usual pattern of checking phones and reviewing the next day's schedule before bed, they sat together on the small balcony overlooking the lights of Amman and continued the conversation that had started the night before. I keep thinking about that line from the wedding song, Catherine said, about walking toward the same star, but forgetting each other's names. Tonight felt like we were remembering our names, but also figuring out how to name the star we're walking toward. What do you think our star is? William asked. Catherine thought for a long moment. I think it's the possibility of being genuinely helpful to people without losing ourselves in the process. Of finding a way to serve that makes us more who we are rather than less. That's a good star to follow, William agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the city and thinking about the conversations they had had over the past 2 days. Both felt as though something fundamental was shifting in their understanding of themselves, their marriage, and their roles, but neither wanted to examine that shift too closely yet. It felt too new, too fragile, too important to risk disrupting with premature analysis. Tomorrow is our last full day, Catherine observed eventually. Yes, the formal dinner with the king and queen, and then we fly home Saturday morning. I don't want this feeling to disappear when we get back to London, Catherine said quietly. This sense of clarity and connection and possibility. I want to figure out how to keep it. We will, William said with more confidence than he felt. We'll have to be intentional about it, and probably creative, but we will. How can you be so sure? William reached for her hand, the gesture that was becoming natural again after months of careful distance. Because for the first time in a long time, I remember why I married you. Not just because I loved you, but because I knew that figuring out life with you would be more interesting and more possible than figuring it out alone. Even when life includes being the future king and queen of England? Especially then, William replied. I think we needed to remember that we chose this together, and that choosing it together gives us power we don't have when we're just trying to survive it individually. They stayed on the balcony until well past midnight, making plans for how to maintain the insights they were gaining in Jordan once they returned to the structures and expectations of their regular life. Some of their plans were practical, scheduling regular time for unguarded conversation, finding ways to engage with ideas and people outside their usual royal circle, being more intentional about the experiences they shared as a family. Other plans were more philosophical, committing to bringing their authentic selves to their royal duties rather than trying to become different people for those duties, supporting each other's individual growth as a way of strengthening their partnership, thinking about their service in terms of what they could uniquely offer rather than just what was expected from their positions. It won't be easy, Catherine acknowledged as they finally prepared for bed. Changing established patterns never is, especially when those patterns involve other people's expectations and institutional pressures. No, William agreed, but it will be easier than the alternative. I can't go back to feeling like we're just two people managing a very complicated job together rather than two people building a life together. Neither can I, Catherine said firmly. As they had the night before, they fell asleep holding hands. But this time, the gesture felt less like desperation and more like determination. Friday morning brought their final day in Jordan, and with it a schedule that seemed almost anticlimactic after the profound conversations and personal revelations of the previous 2 days. William and Catherine had one formal engagement before the evening state dinner, a visit to the Jordan River site where Jesus was believed to have been baptized, followed by a brief ceremony at a memorial for fallen Jordanian soldiers. But even these official duties felt different now. Instead of moving through them with polite professional distance, they found themselves genuinely engaged with the historical and spiritual significance of the places they were visiting. At the baptism site, they stood quietly at the edge of the muddy river that had witnessed thousands of years of humans searching for meaning and transformation. It's strange to think about how many people have come to this exact spot looking for a new beginning, Catherine observed as they watched pilgrims from around the world wading into the shallow water. Maybe that's what we're doing too, William replied quietly, looking for a way to begin again. Their guide, Father Michael, was a soft-spoken Franciscan monk who had been working at the site for 15 years. As he explained the historical significance of the location, he noticed the unusual attentiveness of his royal visitors. Many people come here seeking transformation, he said as they walked along the riverbank. But transformation isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose to participate in. The water doesn't change you. Your willingness to enter it changes you. What if you're not sure what you want to be transformed into? Catherine asked. Father Michael smiled. Then you trust that the desire for transformation itself is guidance enough. Sometimes we have to be willing to let go of who we've been before we can discover who we're meant to become. At the memorial for fallen soldiers, they met families who had lost sons and daughters in Jordan's various military conflicts. The conversations were difficult, but meaningful, touching on themes of sacrifice, duty, and the weight of serving something larger than oneself. One mother, Ahmad, spoke to Catherine about the challenge of being proud of her son's service while grieving his absence. He believed that protecting others was worth any personal cost, Mahmud said through a translator. But, as his mother, I sometimes wonder if we ask too much of people who are willing to give everything for others. The comment struck Catherine deeply. How do you balance honoring his choice with your own grief? She asked. By trying to live in a way that makes his sacrifice meaningful, Mahmud replied. If I become bitter or closed off because of losing him, then his death serves no purpose. But if I become more committed to the values he died protecting, then his life continues through mine. William, who was listening to this exchange while speaking with other family members, found himself thinking about his own relationship with duty and sacrifice. Unlike these families, his service didn't require risking his life, but it did require constantly subordinating his personal desires to public expectations. The conversation with Ahmad suggested a different way of thinking about that subordination, not as a loss of self, but as a way of extending self through service. During the drive back to Amman for their final preparations before the state dinner, William and Catherine reflected on the morning's experiences. The baptism site and the memorial had both dealt with transformation and sacrifice, but from very different perspectives, one focused on personal spiritual renewal, the other on giving oneself for collective good. I keep thinking about what Father Michael said, Catherine said, about transformation being something you choose to participate in rather than something that happens to you. And what Ahmad said about living in a way that makes sacrifice meaningful, William added. Both of them were talking about taking active responsibility for becoming who you need to be rather than just accepting whatever circumstances make you become. Layla, who had been observing their reactions throughout the week, decided this was the right moment for something she had been considering since their first day in Jordan. Your Royal Highnesses, I have one final invitation for you. But this one is quite different from the others. Oh, Catherine prompted. Tonight, after the state dinner, there will be a private gathering at the home of Dr. Yasmin al-Rashid, a retired diplomat who served as Jordan's ambassador to several European countries. She hosts a salon once a month for people who work in international relations, politics, and cultural exchange. Tonight's topic is the future of monarchy in the modern world. William and Catherine exchanged a look that was part interest and part apprehension. What kind of discussion would that involve? William asked carefully. Quite frank, quite challenging, Layla admitted. Dr. al-Rashid believes that institutions can only survive by constantly questioning their own relevance and effectiveness. The participants tonight will include former ambassadors, political scientists, historians, and social critics from several countries. They won't treat you as guests to be deferred to. They'll treat you as representatives of an institution they want to understand and possibly challenge. That sounds either very helpful or very uncomfortable, Catherine observed. Probably both, Layla agreed. But Dr. al-Rashid specifically requested that I extend the invitation because she believes that monarchy's future depends on monarchs who are willing to engage seriously with questions about their own purpose and legitimacy. William considered this for a moment. You're saying we'd be walking into a room full of people who might argue that monarchy should be abolished entirely? Among other things, yes. But also people who might argue for ways monarchy could evolve to serve modern democratic values. And people who might have insights into how other institutions have successfully transformed themselves without losing their essential purpose. It sounds terrifying, Catherine said. Then, she looked at William with a slight smile. Which probably means we should do it. Agreed, William said. We've spent this week learning to have honest conversations about difficult topics. This would just be extending that learning to our professional lives. The state dinner that evening was a formal affair held in one of the king's private palaces outside Amman. The setting was magnificent. Traditional Jordanian architecture enhanced with contemporary art, gardens lit with thousands of small lanterns, and tables arranged to encourage conversation rather than ceremonial display. King Abdullah and Queen Rania had clearly put considerable thought into creating an atmosphere that honored their guests while showcasing Jordan's unique cultural identity. The guest list included government officials, business leaders, cultural figures, and representatives from various international organizations. William and Catherine moved through the evening with their usual professional grace, but something fundamental had changed in how they engaged with their role. Instead of simply fulfilling protocol requirements, they found themselves genuinely curious about Jordan's challenges and opportunities, asking questions that went beyond diplomatic politeness. During dinner, Catherine sat next to Dr. Noor al-Hussein, Jordan's Minister of Education, and found herself deep in conversation about innovative approaches to refugee education. Dr. al-Hussein was describing pilot programs that use technology to provide Syrian refugee children with access to their home country's curriculum while also integrating them into Jordanian schools. The challenge, Dr. al-Hussein explained, is helping children maintain connection to their cultural identity while also preparing them to succeed in whatever country becomes their permanent home. They need roots and wings simultaneously. That sounds like a challenge many people face, Catherine observed thoughtfully. How to honor where you come from while adapting to where you find yourself. Dr. al-Hussein looked at Catherine with sharp attention. Indeed, though I suspect the specific balance required varies considerably depending on how much choice one has about where one finds oneself. The comment was subtle but pointed, and Catherine recognized that Dr. al-Hussein was inviting a more personal conversation about the challenges of adapting to roles one doesn't choose. Instead of deflecting with diplomatic generalities, Catherine decided to engage honestly. Choice is an interesting concept, she said carefully. Sometimes what appears to be choice is really just accepting the least problematic of several difficult options. But I'm learning that even when your general circumstances aren't freely chosen, you can still choose how to inhabit those circumstances. That's a sophisticated perspective, Dr. al-Hussein replied approvingly, and one that suggests you've been thinking seriously about these questions. Meanwhile, William was engaged in an equally substantive conversation with Dr. Khalil Mansour, the philosophy professor who had led the previous evening's discussion. Dr. Mansour had been invited to the dinner because of his expertise in political theory, and he was pressing William on questions about the democratic legitimacy of inherited authority. The argument for monarchy, Dr. Mansour was saying, traditionally rests on the idea that some forms of authority transcend popular will, divine right, historical continuity, symbolic representation of national identity. But in an era when democratic participation is seen as the basis of legitimate government, how do you justify wielding authority you didn't earn through democratic processes? William felt his usual diplomatic training urging him to deflect the question with pleasantries about constitutional monarchy and serving the will of the people. But something about the week in Jordan, the conversations about authenticity and service, made him want to engage with the question seriously rather than diplomatically. I think, he said slowly, that the traditional justifications for monarchy are largely obsolete. Divine right is meaningless in a secular society, and historical continuity by itself isn't sufficient reason to maintain any institution. But maybe there's a different justification we haven't fully explored, which is maybe the value of monarchy in a democratic society isn't in wielding authority, but in modeling a different relationship to power altogether. Instead of seeking power, accepting responsibility. Instead of pursuing personal agenda, serving collective good. Instead of trying to be popular, trying to be useful. Dr. Mansour raised an eyebrow. That's quite idealistic, and it assumes that monarchs are actually capable of subordinating personal interests to public good in ways that elected officials aren't. It assumes that if they can't, William replied, then monarchy should indeed be abolished. But it also suggests that the question isn't whether monarchy is inherently legitimate, but whether particular monarchs can earn legitimacy through the quality of their service. You're arguing for monarchy as a performance rather than monarchy as an inherited right. I'm arguing for monarchy as a vocation rather than monarchy as a privilege. The conversation continued throughout dinner, ranging across questions of constitutional theory, democratic legitimacy, and the role of traditional institutions in modern societies. What struck both William and Catherine was how intellectually stimulating it was to defend positions they actually believed rather than simply reciting talking points they had been given. After dinner, King Abdullah offered a brief toast that captured something essential about the evening and the week that had preceded it. "To our British friends," he said, raising his glass, "who have shown us this week that diplomatic visits can be opportunities for genuine exchange rather than mere ceremony. You have honored Jordan not only with your presence, but with your curiosity, your openness to learning, and your willingness to engage authentically with our people and our perspectives. We hope Jordan has given you something valuable in return." "More than you know," William replied when invited to respond. "This week has reminded us that the most important conversations often happen in the spaces between formal events, when protocol gives way to genuine human connection. Jordan has taught us that being authentic within our roles serves others better than simply performing those roles correctly." As the evening wound down and guests began to say their farewells, Layla approached William and Catherine with Dr. Yasmin Al-Rashid, the potential host for the late evening salon discussion. Dr. Al-Rashid was a striking woman in her 70s, with silver hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that comes from decades of navigating complex international relationships. She greeted William and Catherine with the warmth of someone who was genuinely pleased to meet them, but also with the directness of someone who had no intention of treating them as anything other than serious adults. "I understand you've been having interesting conversations this week," she said without preamble. "Layla tells me you're willing to engage with challenging questions about monarchy's place in the modern world." "We're learning to engage with challenging questions about our own place in the modern world," Catherine replied, "which seems to be closely related." Dr. Al-Rashid smiled approvingly. "Indeed it is. Well, if you're interested in continuing that conversation, my guest tonight includes some very smart people with very strong opinions. Fair warning, they will not defer to you. They will not soften their critiques out of politeness, and they will expect you to defend your positions with logic rather than tradition." "That sounds exactly like what we need," William said. An hour later, William and Catherine found themselves in DR. Al-Rashid's elegant sitting room with 8 other people, a former British ambassador to several Middle Eastern countries, a German political scientist who specialized in constitutional monarchy, a Pakistani journalist who covered international politics, an Egyptian historian, a Canadian diplomat, a French professor of political theory, and 2 Jordanian experts in governance and international law. Dr. Al-Rashid opened the discussion with characteristic directness. "Our topic tonight is the future of monarchy in the modern world. Our guests from Britain represent one of the few remaining monarchies with significant international influence, so their perspectives should be particularly valuable. But before we hear from them, let's establish the questions we're trying to answer. The fundamental question," said Dr. Sarah Chun, the political scientist from Germany, "is whether monarchy can serve democratic values or whether it inherently undermines them. Democratic theory suggests that authority should be accountable to the people and derived from popular consent. Monarchy suggests that some authority transcends popular will. But that's only problematic if you assume monarchy claims authority," interjected Professor Du Bois from France. "What if monarchy's function isn't to exercise authority, but to embody continuity, to represent values and traditions that transcend partisan politics? Symbolic representation is still a form of power," pointed out Fatima Hassan, the Egyptian historian. "When monarchs appear at state functions, when their approval or disapproval influences public opinion, when their personal behavior affects national reputation, that's real power, whether it's called symbolic or not." The conversation quickly intensified, with participants building on and challenging each other's arguments with the kind of intellectual rigor that comes from genuine expertise and genuine disagreement. William and Catherine listened for the first 20 minutes, trying to understand the full scope of the debate before contributing their own perspectives. Finally, Dr. Al-Rashid turned to them directly. "You've been unusually quiet. As representatives of monarchy, what's your response to these critiques?" Catherine took a deep breath. "I think most of the critiques are valid," she said, surprising several people in the room. Monarchy does exercise power without democratic accountability. It does claim authority based on inheritance rather than merit. And it does perpetuate class distinctions that many people find objectionable. But, prompted Dr. Al-Rashid. But I think the question is whether those problems are inherent to the concept of monarchy or whether they're problems with how monarchy has traditionally been practiced. What if monarchy could evolve into something different while maintaining its useful functions? What useful functions? Asked Robert Morrison, the former British ambassador. His tone wasn't hostile, but it was definitely skeptical. William leaned forward in his chair. Continuity across political cycles, for one thing. In democratic systems, governments change every few years, which can make long-term planning difficult. A constitutional monarch who stays above partisan politics can advocate for policies that serve future generations, even when they're unpopular with current voters. That assumes monarchs have better judgment about long-term interests than democratically elected leaders, pointed out Amara Qureshi, the Pakistani journalist. Not better judgment necessarily, William replied. Different incentives. An elected politician needs to maintain popularity to stay in power. A constitutional monarch's position doesn't depend on popularity, which creates freedom to advocate for difficult truths, but also creates freedom to be completely unaccountable, Dr. Chen observed. True, Catherine acknowledged, which is why I think monarchy's future depends on monarchs choosing accountability even when they're not required to be accountable, submitting to scrutiny, explaining their decisions, accepting criticism, and changing course when they're wrong. Professor Du Bois looked intrigued. You're describing monarchy as a kind of voluntary public service rather than an inherited privilege. Exactly, William said. What if the legitimacy of monarchy depended not on tradition or divine right, but on the ongoing consent of the people based on the quality of service provided? That's essentially what already happens in countries like Sweden and Denmark, pointed out Dr. Hassan. Monarchy continues to exist because people find it useful, not because they believe in royal authority. But it requires monarchs who understand that their role is to earn legitimacy through service rather than to claim legitimacy through inheritance, added Dr. Al-Rashid. Which brings us to a crucial question. Are you prepared to accept that level of accountability? To have your effectiveness constantly evaluated by people who have no obligation to defer to your position? Catherine and William looked at each other. It was a moment of truth that encapsulated everything they had been learning about themselves and their roles over the past week. Yes, Catherine said finally. In fact, I think we need that kind of accountability to be effective. If we're not constantly questioning whether we're serving people well, if we're not willing to change when we're not serving them well, then we're just expensive decorations. The harder question, William added, is whether we can create systems that provide that accountability without either turning monarchy into a popularity contest or paralyzing it with constant criticism. What would those systems look like? Asked the Canadian diplomat, Helen Clark, who had been following the conversation with obvious interest. Regular formal reviews of royal activities by parliamentary committees, suggested Dr. Chen. Public reports on how royal time and resources are being used. Clear metrics for measuring the effectiveness of royal charitable and diplomatic work. Annual addresses to Parliament where monarchs explain their priorities and defend their choices, added Mr. Morrison. Not ceremonial speeches, but actual policy presentations that can be questioned and debated. Public forums where citizens can directly challenge royal decisions, suggested Ms. Qureshi. Town halls, debates, structured dialogues where royal authority has to justify itself to ordinary people. The conversation continued for another hour, becoming increasingly specific about practical mechanisms for making monarchy accountable to democratic values. What impressed everyone in the room, including William and Catherine, was how much the discussion revealed possibilities they hadn't previously considered. I'm struck, Dr. Al-Rashid observed toward the end of the evening, by how much this conversation has focused on what monarchy could become rather than whether it should continue to exist. that suggests that the institution has more potential for evolution than some of its critics assume. But it also suggests, added Professor Du Bois, that realizing that potential would require monarchs who are willing to fundamentally redefine their relationship to power and privilege. Which brings us back to our original question, concluded Dr. Hassan. Not whether monarchy can theoretically evolve, but whether particular monarchs are willing to drive that evolution. As the evening concluded and participants began saying their goodbyes, several people approached William and Catherine individually to continue specific aspects of the conversation. Dr. Chun gave Catherine her contact information and suggested ongoing dialogue about constitutional reform. Professor Du Bois invited William to speak at an upcoming conference on democratic institutions. Ms. Qureshi asked if they would be willing to participate in a documentary about monarchy's future. "You've surprised people tonight," Dr. Al-Rashid told them as they prepared to leave. Most royals avoid these kinds of conversations because they're afraid of the questions that might be raised. Your willingness to engage seriously with criticism of your own institution suggests a level of intellectual courage that's quite rare. "Thank you," Catherine replied. "Though I should admit that a week ago, we probably would have avoided this conversation. Something about being in Jordan has made us braver about asking difficult questions." "Jordan has that effect, Dr. Al-Rashid said with a smile. "There's something about being in a place where different worlds meet that helps you see your own world more clearly." Driving back to their hotel through the quiet streets of Amman, William and Catherine processed the evening in thoughtful silence. They had spent 3 hours defending monarchy to people who had serious intellectual and philosophical objections to the institution, and they had found themselves articulating positions they hadn't fully realized they held. "That was intense," Catherine said finally. "But useful," William replied. "I feel like we've been forced to think much more clearly about what we actually believe our role should be versus what tradition says it is." Dr. Chen's point about accountability systems was interesting. Most of the mechanisms she suggested aren't that radical. They're just formal versions of what effective leaders in any field do voluntarily. The difference is that we would be doing them as monarchs rather than as elected officials, which might actually make them more meaningful because we wouldn't have partisan political motivations for how we present our work. Catherine laughed. "Listen to us. A week ago, we were complaining about feeling trapped by our roles, and now we're making plans to make those roles even more demanding. But more honest," William pointed out, "and more connected to actual service rather than just ceremonial performance. Do you think we can actually implement any of these ideas when we get back to London?" William considered the question seriously. "Not immediately. The system we work within has its own momentum and expectations. But I think we can start moving in that direction, especially if we're careful about how we frame the changes." "What do you mean?" "We frame them as ways to strengthen monarchy rather than ways to question monarchy. We emphasize how accountability and transparency serve the institution's long-term interests. We pilot small changes and demonstrate their value before proposing larger reforms." Catherine nodded. "And we make sure we're already excelling at the traditional aspects of our roles before we start expanding what those roles include." "Exactly. We earn the credibility to innovate by proving we can perform excellently within existing expectations." They spent the rest of the drive making specific plans for how to begin implementing some of the ideas that had emerged from the evening's discussion. Some were relatively simple, committing to more substantive engagement with parliamentary committees, requesting regular feedback on their charitable and diplomatic work, being more transparent about how they prioritize their time and attention. Others were more complex and would require careful negotiation with the palace, the government, and the media, participating in public forums where citizens could question their decisions, submitting to regular performance reviews, being more explicit about their policy positions on issues where they had expertise. "The key thing," William said as they arrived back at their hotel, "is that we start thinking of ourselves as public servants who happen to be monarchs, rather than monarchs who happen to serve the public." "That's a profound distinction," Catherine agreed. "And it changes everything about how we approach our work." As they prepared for bed on their final night in Jordan, both William and Catherine felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about returning to London. They had experienced a week of intellectual and emotional transformation that had fundamentally altered how they understood their marriage, their roles, and their possibilities. Now, they had to figure out how to maintain and build on those insights within the structures and expectations of their regular life. "Whatever happens when we get home," Catherine said as they settled into bed, "I want to remember this feeling." "What feeling?" "The feeling that we're capable of growing into something better than what we are right now. The feeling that our problems are solvable and our roles are meaningful and our marriage is strong enough to support us both becoming more ourselves rather than less." "We will remember," William said confidently, "because we're going to keep having conversations like the ones we've had this week. Maybe not exactly like them, but conversations where we challenge ourselves to think clearly and honestly about difficult questions." "Promise." "Promise." For the third night in a row, they fell asleep holding hands. But this time, the gesture felt less like comfort